Today I'm going to be picking up my conversation with our next section of Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. Today I'm going to be talking about chapters 9 through 17. We'll talk a little bit about summary, and then we'll talk about some final thoughts to kind of leave you with as we move forward. So in our story, we have... the Bennet sisters, the oldest two sisters, are still at Netherfield, and so Mrs. Bennet is going to pay a visit in the beginning of chapter 9 to Netherfield with Lydia and Kitty to visit Jane and see how she is doing. You know, Jane is still unwell from riding in the rain, and so she spends much to Elizabeth's chagrin. She spends the majority of her visit embarrassing herself, making a fool out of herself. She talks about the comparison of country life being better to city life, and then she goes on and on and on about Jane's beauty, despite Elizabeth trying to get her to stop in front of the Bingleys and Darcy. Lydia asks Bingley if he plans to hold a ball at Netherfield, which he agrees to do as soon as Jane recovers. That evening, we see Miss Bingley, the unmarried Miss Bingley, we see her start her plan into play to get Darcy's attention. And so she piles compliments on him. She is always trying to get his attention she really is just trying to morph herself into someone that Mr. Darcy would be attracted to. That same evening, Elizabeth and Darcy have another argument. Miss Bingley plays some music on the pianoforte, and Elizabeth refuses yet again to dance with Darcy, which works kind of on the opposite effect. You know, it should be like shutting out his affection, but he likes her more and more with every opportunity that he has with her. Miss Bingley notices that, of course, so she spends the next 3 days literally alternating between trying to get Darcy's attention and making fun of Elizabeth's family. She brings up several points about how hilarious it would be if Darcy attached himself with the Bennet family, and because of how ridiculous they are, because they're poor and because they don't have any connections. She attempts to read books that he is interested in, thinking that would make her seem more interesting to him. One particular instance within this section, she gets Elizabeth to stand up and walk around the room with her, and they're having a conversation about Mr. Darcy, and if he has faults, that he has a fault, and it's really to kind of throw the two girls into contrast. So Miss Bingley is of good breeding, she's proper, and all these things, obviously, and she's wealthy, she's well dressed, and in comparison, you know, Elizabeth is plainer in a lot of ways. But it's her attention that Darcy really wants, and so she thinks that by standing in front of him, the two of them together, that he would see obviously that she's the better choice. But that's not. We find that that's not the case. Elizabeth writes a letter home, asks to come home. Mrs. Bennet says, nope, not yet. You haven't spent enough time there, because she wants to keep Jane in Bingley's presence for longer. And Elizabeth asks Bingley for the use of his carriage. So they head home. And Darcy is kind of glad to see them go, because he has found himself liking Elizabeth much more than he really wanted to. So a couple of final thoughts on that section before we move on to the next set of chapters is that I think that the longer that Elizabeth stays, the stronger the differences in the attitudes between Miss Bingley and Darcy get towards their guests, because Elizabeth poses a threat to each of them. To Miss Bingley, like, she wants Darcy for herself. So she is a rival for Darcy's affection, and Darcy, on the other hand, fears that the more time he spends with Elizabeth, the more likely it is that he is going to fall victim to his growing attraction for her. And remember, he doesn't want to be attracted to her because of her situation, because she's beneath him socially, inferior in rank and in family, and her family is absolutely ridiculous, right? So he's concerned that and only concerned that he may affect his own reputation by linking it to the poor reputation of another. And that really becomes like the crux of this whole situation. Class consciousness transforms Elizabeth, who is perfect for him in every other way except for the fact that she is not wealthy and that she doesn't have connections. And Miss Bingley feel and that she's something to be feared. And Miss Bingley pulls the only weapon that she knows to use because she knows that she cannot compete with Elizabeth's intelligence, her wit, her virtues, her talents. The only thing that she has on her side is the fact that she was born wealthy. And so she uses class as a weapon to try to undermine Elizabeth in Darcy's eyes. Okay, so 13 through 17. Summary wise, Elizabeth and Jane return from Netherfield. They learn that their cousin, Mr. Collins, is going to be paying the Bennets a visit. Collins is the closest living male relative, and he will inherit all of the Bennet property once Mr. Bennet passes away. He's a clergyman, which means that he's a minister, and he is currently residing as the parish priest on the property that is owned by a very wealthy noblewoman. Her name is Lady Catherine de Bourgh. Obviously, his arrival is not a welcome one for the family. The family is aware very much that he will inherit everything that they own. And so they're not happy at that fact because they don't know whether or not he's going to cast them out, throw them out of the house. As soon as the father is dead, which was a possibility. If he inherited, he was under no obligation to keep the family up, and so they don't know if that's going to be the case. But he makes it immediately clear when he arrives at the house that he plans to choose one of the daughters to marry, and hoping that connection would satisfy everybody. He would gain a wife, which he's been encouraged to do by Lady Catherine de Bourgh, and the Bennets would have some financial security. They might be able to remain in the home, and that would be a situation that worked well for both of them. Jane immediately catches his eye because of the sisters. She is the most beautiful, but Mrs. Bennet hints to him that she's very soon to be engaged or likely to be engaged, and so he switches his attentions to Elizabeth. On a trip to town, they run into Mr. Wickham, who is very charming and very good looking. He's just joined the military. They have a little conversation, the girls and Mr. Wickham and Mr. Collins. And Darcy and Bingley happen to ride by, and Elizabeth notices that there's kind of this weird, chill, cold vibe between Darcy and Mr. Wickham, but she doesn't say anything about it at the time. So at a dinner party, a couple of nights later, Darcy or Wickham becomes the center of attention. He forces his place next to Elizabeth so that he can have a conversation with her, and they fall into an easy chit-chat about his life. And he spills all this crazy stuff. He planned on entering the ministry. He was unable to do so because he had no money, so he had to become a soldier, and that he had been acquainted with Darcy from a very young age, and that Darcy's father was leaving provisions for him in his will. He was going to give him a fortune. He was going to give him a position in the clergy in the church in his parish, and that Darcy used a loophole in the will to keep all of the money for himself. And so Elizabeth accepts this story absolutely immediately, and finds herself kind of really liking and trusting Wickham. Later at the party, he tells her that Lady Catherine de Bourgh is Darcy's aunt. And Elizabeth leaves the party thinking of nothing but Mr. Wickham and all that he had told her all the way home, and decided that Darcy deserves to be shunned for his behavior, his treatment of Mr. Wickham. So she tells all this to Jane, her sister, and her sister says, you know what, there's got to be some kind of misunderstanding, because it would have really been socially inept and inappropriate for him to take and give the contents of the will to someone else or keep it for himself and not honor his father's wishes. But Elizabeth is sure that Darcy deserves to be hated for this, and she refuses Jane's suggestion, and she's looking forward to seeing Mr. Wickham at the ball. And so these two chapters, these kind of final thoughts on this one, these two chapters are the set of chapters introduce Mr. Collins and Mr. Wickham, and their characters, even though they're minor, they play major roles in our plot story. So Mr. Collins is kind of the target of Austen's greatest satire in the book, and Wickham is definitely going to become the novel's most illustrious character, and you'll figure out what that kind of means as we go along. So Collins, the knowledge that he is going to inherit the Bennet estate, kind of initiates criticism of the law of entailment, and that Mr. Bennet is forced to leave his property to this ridiculous man that they barely know, that they've never really met, and instead of to his own daughters because of the law. It's because of a law that forbids them to have it. And so their fate hinges on Mr. Collins' treatment of them after Mr. Bennet's death. Collins himself is very full. He feels self-important. He believes very wholeheartedly in class, although he only gains second helpings, like cast-offs of society. He is only of any importance because he is under Lady Catherine's patronage. He makes long, foolish speeches. He's absolutely absurd. Everybody makes fun of him. The charming Mr. Wickham, on the other hand, is one of the only male characters in the entire story that's physically described by Austen. He's extremely good looking, and he's taken at face value, and he's got a pretty face, so that serves him really well. But deep down, there's a lot more to him than meets the eye. The fact that he's good looking, the fact that he's charming, help make his story of Darcy's mistreatment of him very believable. And because Darcy's pride has been so obvious from the very first moment that we meet him, Elizabeth's decision to wholeheartedly trust Wickham introduces her prejudice into the story. We, as readers, are wondering why this dude would sit down and spill this crazy family story to someone he barely even knows. But Elizabeth is like, no doubt this is what happened. And she doesn't even bother to seek out Darcy's side of this story before she makes judgments against him. So that's that whole testament of the power of first impressions to our story. She dislikes Darcy almost from the moment they're introduced, and she's enchanted with Wickham from their first acquaintance, which is going to cause a little flux in our plot.